Hello, today we're going to talk about style and tone. This is something that is obviously not a primary concern when you're writing an essay because you need to first make sure your ideas are good, your structure is solid. But once you start getting towards your first complete draft, you really need to start thinking about how your word choice and your sentence structure has that added impact. So we're going to look, as I said, style and tone, and this relates to what you read in Chapter 8 of the QAC, the Quick Access Compact. Now, first of all, when we talk about style, we're specifically talking about sentence level. Okay, so consider the following samples. First, I like superhero movies. The Avengers is good. I did not like the most recent one. Now we can change that into a single sentence that uses things like conjunctions, different punctuation than just having these short, choppy sentences. So I like superhero movies. However, even though The Avengers is good, I did not like the most recent one. This is a sample of style change in the sentence level being different, even if the words are nearly the same. Okay, so that's something that you can consider when writing. But we also have to consider our tone. Okay, and when you talk about the tone of your writing, you're really just talking about the word level, the word choice that you make in your writing. So look at how this can change from this original comment about liking superhero movies. I adore superhero movies. The Avengers epitomizes good filmmaking. The most recent outing, though, was abysmal. Different words that carry a different tone once we start having these more colorful words, more meaningful words. Saying I did not like the most recent one versus most recent outing. Different word was abysmal. Can really change the feel of what we're writing for our reader. So that's what we're talking about today. Okay? Now, when we're dealing with styles and tones, there are different categories, but we're mostly going to focus on formal, casual, and slang. Okay? Great examples of that. Formal would be saying he has no available funds. There's nothing informal about that, right? There's no contractions, nothing that you would feel uncomfortable with saying to a boss, teacher, etc. Casual is a little bit more relaxed, saying he's broke. Broke is not the most technical term for being without money, but it's also not anything that anybody would bat an eyelash at. We've got a contraction, a little bit less formal. And then slang, the least formal, is he's hella broke. As you can see, I get a red squiggly line. The dictionary doesn't even recognize that. As we talked about in our first discussion, or one of our early discussions on D2L, there's not really anything wrong with slang. It still can be very valuable language. That's why we use it so much. But the fact of the matter is, when we write an essay, we're expecting different things. It's that whole purpose and audience piece. So for our different essays, depending, we're typically going to aim for formal, with maybe some casual language thrown in. But with our literacy narrative, it's a little bit different. Here, you can definitely focus more on casual and even some slang, because a narrative connecting with the reader on that more personal level can get away with those things. That maybe wouldn't be okay in an argument essay. Once again, it's a purpose, audience, concern. Okay. So these are all things, like I said, that were mentioned in QAC Chapter 8. I just wanted to reiterate some of those things. But a few additional things that I want you to take note of, some talked about in the book, some not as much, have to do with certain style and tone concerns. Okay? And the first of those is what we call idiomatic language. Okay? What we're talking about here is when you use a word plus a preposition instead of just a single word. Okay? So for instance, you could say that you mention something, or you could say that you bring up something, right? Same thing, exercise versus work out. Obviously saying you bring up something or work out is not wrong, but when you want to have your strength of language, to have a stronger tone in that essay writing, it's better to have the single word, something like mention or exercise. It's just a little bit more direct. It's going to not mince words in another way of thinking. Okay? Even more important, though, is not so much something being better than the other choice, but rather when something just simply doesn't work. Logical constructions are where you're using words that shouldn't really be there. For instance, this sentence, "The dog which bit me is ferocious," is perfect. Perfectly worded, expresses your feelings quite well. However, sometimes when it comes to the word which, some students and other writers like to add in the word in or at. So something like "the dog in which bit me is ferocious" doesn't really make sense, because "in which" would mean that you're in the dog. So the dog that you were inside of bit you doesn't really make sense. So just keep in mind that you want to read the sentence to make sure it makes sense. Okay? Another concern that we want to pay attention to that they mentioned in the book was slang or colloquialism. Okay, or colloquialism. There you go. For this is what we talked about in that discussion question, as I mentioned. And the thing is, this is absolutely appropriate for a narrative. Not so much for a later essay, as we'll talk about. Once again, purpose, audience, concern. But you can definitely be a little bit less formal in your literacy narrative. You still want it to be strong. You still want it to be structured well. But in your dialogue, for instance, you can definitely bring in some of these less formal terms, because I want it to seem authentic. I don't expect you to be very stuffy when you're talking to your friend between classes in the story, etc. Okay? Another concern that we want to pay attention to are cliches. A cliche is an overused phrase. So for instance, if somebody was stubborn and you say "stubborn as a mule," that would be a cliche. "It's raining cats and dogs," that would be a cliche. Phrases that don't really mean much since they're so overused. But it's still important to express certain ideas, right? For instance, you may have somebody who absolutely was stubborn. One way to express that would be, say, maybe "stubborn as a broken doorknob," right? Come up with your own comparison, not one that you've heard a million times from other people, okay? And finally, one last thing I want you to consider with your tone. It's what we call biased language, okay? Language that carries a certain feeling with it just based on the words that you use, okay? Consider these two sentences, or not sentences, these phrases. "The girl in my class" and "the boy in my class." Most of you, I would guess, would feel comfortable talking about people in your class who are female as a girl. "Oh, that girl in my class, that girl in my math class," right? Even though we're dealing with people who are adults, right? However, how many of you would feel comfortable calling a male student boy? "Oh yeah, this boy in my class," or "oh, that boy sitting over there." Some may feel comfortable doing that, but typically it's not as accepted. Even though girl and boy are absolutely connected terms, right? They're the gender divide of this diminutive form typically reserved for children. It's interesting that we have no problem typically referring to adult women as girls, but maybe we should be a little bit more concerned with that, just as men, you probably don't want to be called boys. So these are the kinds of things that you can consider. So instead of saying "the girl in my class," perhaps it would be better to say "the young woman in my class," okay? Something along those lines. Now, of course, if you are literally talking about a girl, maybe you're reminiscing about your third grade classroom for your literacy narrative, clearly the language should match that. But when I talk about biased language, that's what I mean, to pay attention to certain characteristics that are being carried in your language, okay? So those are a few key things I wanted to mention when it comes to tone and style. There's an activity on D12 that I would like you to do to consider this further. But as you're writing, just really pay attention to what words you're using, and think if you can come up with better ones to have the most expressive writing you can. Great. Thanks.